Okay, so very weird experience my ex-girlfriend and I had back in 0405 in Royal, Louisiana. We were hanging out at our parents' house on a summer night watching movies, nothing out of the ordinary. We were around 16 or 17 at the time, so when 1 a.m. rolled around, it was time for me to head home. I didn't have a vehicle at this point, so she would usually drop me off. Keep this in mind, it's a rural area in Louisiana, and we lived on the complete opposite sides of town. At this time of night, there were hardly any cars on the road, and it was rather spooky driving through the wooded areas to get to my place, which was secluded to say the least. We were about halfway to our destination, and in mid-conversation, when she stopped talking and asked me if I noticed the headlights that had been behind us for quite some time. I replied no, that I hadn't noticed, but assured her that there was nothing to worry about. We continued our conversation, but now I was really paying attention to the headlights behind us and noticed that they were getting closer. To get to my house, there were a lot of turns down roads that weren't main roads, and these headlights were staying with us. At this point, panic starts to set in for both of us as we try to come up with a worst case scenario plan. I thought of just pulling up into the first driveway, but then thought, what if no one's home? And would they even help us at this time of night? Scratch that idea. I had one of those old flip phones at the time and decided that the best course of action was to call my house phone and hope that my dad would answer. Between that point and us turning down my dead-end road, I probably called 8 to 10 times with no answer, with the headlights still following us at every turn. I told my girlfriend to just pull into my driveway and lay on the horn. We pull in and do just that. The other vehicle pulls in right behind us. No one is coming out of the house, so she decides to cut across my front yard and try to get back on the road, while I'm still calling. As we go to turn around, the other car cuts us off, and that's when I look at this man, probably 50 to 60 years old, large rimmed glasses, and smoking a cigarette. Our eyes met, and he gave me the weirdest, creepiest grin. And that's when I made up my mind that I was going to have to get out and confront this man. Right as I was building up the courage to do so, my dad ran out the front door, and the man in the car sped away. Needless to say, we didn't get very much sleep that night. She stayed at my place, and we reported the incident with the best description we could give, but to no avail. My mom left our family my freshman year of high school. She moved a few hours away with her new boyfriend, and we had no contact. Around my junior year, my mom reaches out. She tells my dad that I need to be inside at all times. She had recently left her meth head boyfriend, who was about to go on trial for conspiracy to commit murder. I know, he was a real winner. She was going to testify against him, so he sent people to kill her, as homicidal dirtbags do. He sent people to her apartment complex, because that's where she tended to go after they got into fights. Really abusive guy. So we get this call, and I don't really take it seriously at the time, because why would they ever come after us? I started seeing a lot of bikers in random cars doing laps around our complex, slowing down right in front of our door. Until one day, I pull up to my spot and there's a guy leaning on his car. He perks up when I get out. I turned around and we just stared at each other. He then climbs back into his car and drives away. I go inside, tell my dad. My dad goes nuts and I am standing there like an idiot, wondering what the heck was going on. He then proceeds to tell me that the reason she reached out to us wasn't because they were after us, necessarily, but because she and I looked identical. So if I hadn't turned around to face the guy, who knows what would have happened. To my mom and her crazy, hopefully ex-boyfriend, let's not meet. When I was younger, I remember that I was home with my family. It was dark outside, and there was a knock on the door, and one of my parents answered the door. I was in a different room, so I didn't hear or see what happened, but he was asking about his pink dog. I guess the guy left, I don't know what happened next, but my dad was rushing to the back of the house and went outside via the back door. I could sense the tension and it scared me. I asked my parents about it and they told me that they were worried that there was another person going around the back of the house. I didn't realize what they were so worried about, but it still made me terrified at the time. I now realize that it could have been a home invasion attempt. I think it's part of the reason why I'm so terrified and paranoid about a possible break-in or robbery. Every time I'm in the house on my own, I stay in my room and keep the dresser drawers open because I don't have a lock on my bedroom door, and it would prevent anyone from entering. Another poster inspired me to tell the story of how I creeped out a creepy person. My dad used to have questionable habits. That's polite code for being an addict. Therefore, strange folks used to come to the house. When I was younger, we often had strangers come to the house while my siblings and I were alone. They'd knock on the door and try to get inside, and if they saw us, they tried to coax us into opening the door. Obviously, we never did. This particular situation occurred when my parents were actually home and my siblings already moved out. A car I didn't recognize started pulling into the driveway. Keep in mind, we lived in the mountains and the property was private, so absolutely nobody should be on our property. When the car parked, a familiar person got outside the vehicle. It was one of my dad's buddies, one that I was told was supposed to stay the hell away from us and was not a good person. He noticed me peeking through the curtains and tried to wave, but I shut them and called for my parents. My dad wouldn't leave his room, so my mother had to go inform him of the arrival of his friend. Our door had a glass oval design on it, and we had a clear screen door as well. So I'm staring at this guy through the oval glass door, and it's obviously making him uncomfortable. Ma goes outside and tells him that my dad will be out, but dude wanted to come inside himself rather than wait. From what I'm told, this man was potentially dangerous, so I had armed myself with the largest kitchen knife we had. My mom told me it was fine and he would be leaving soon, so I decided to put the knife away. But dude still walks through the door uninvited and makes eye contact with me, large knife in hand, halfway in the knife holder, with an angry look on my face and says, "You know what? I think I'm gonna wait outside. Just tell him I'm here. Thanks." And left abruptly. He never came back to the house after that day. He actually ended up going missing for 2 days. His mom frantically spammed my parents. He eventually stumbled out of the woods, and it turns out a deal gone bad ended with him getting beaten up and strung up in a tree, by his ankles I think. So I moved into a duplex with my ex about 3 years ago, in what we thought was a safer part of the city. One of our neighbors, Amber, works in the duplex rental office, and her husband, Ed, was at the time fresh out of prison. Later we would see all of the swastika tattoos, and had been and continues to do landscape work for the rentals like mow the lawns, cut down trees, etc. Other than that, he's at home mostly doing odds and end things, like tinkering with his mower or truck or something. They're both super nice people, very kind and loving towards others. We have smoked weed together a few times. Ed smokes more than Amber, and have talked about all kinds of things, so I thought I could trust them, and felt very safe being their neighbor. I once mentioned how sometimes when I'm home alone, I hear steps in the attic over my room and what sounds like a chair being dragged. How sometimes the noise follows me around the house and always freaks me out, to the point of calling someone just to feel a little safer until the noises die down. Ed said, "What, you think we're spying on you?" in a laughing way, but it creeped me out a little. So then, I break up with my boyfriend and he moves out. This is recent, so a few months ago. Ed starts texting me and asks me if I want to smoke, while Amber's still at work. I declined every time, finding different excuses because I still felt uncomfortable around him. Then he asked me if I wanted to have sex with him because he thinks Amber is cheating on him. I definitely shut that down, and it was awkward as fuck. I didn't tell Amber because I didn't want to be kicked out or have some horrible awkward tension, and I also hate confrontation, so I kept quiet. That's when I start hearing things in the attic above my room more often. It freaked me out even more when I woke up to the loud bang outside my front door about 3 or 4 in the morning. When I went to examine it, there was a small lockpick outside the door on the ground, but no one was around. I kept the lockpick, and the next day I texted a picture to Amber to let her know that I thought someone was creeping around, and she said, "Oh, that's Ed. That's his ice pick, not a lockpick, sweetie. No one can pick your deadbolt with that." But I know the difference in a 4-inch skinny ass lockpick and an ice pick. I was so scared to be alone here, especially at night. Our attics connect, and it's not outlandish to think that he could have been spying on me. I even found freshly drilled holes in the ceiling of my room. I just put wadded up pieces of paper in it and try not to think of it. I honestly hope nothing comes of it and that I'm just being paranoid. Edit. For everyone that's saying I should call the police, I really have no evidence. I have the lockpick and still pictures of the door being messed with, but when I've gone into the attic, it's completely empty. I've never gone in it alone because its opening is in my garage and there's no ladder, so it requires 2 people. But as of now, it's a gaping hole above my washer and dryer, and it's very hard to get in without good upper body strength. I'd call my ex to come home when the dragging would start, but by the time he got there, it'd be cleared out. So I'm hesitant to report anything with no evidence. I'm staying with my boyfriend until I move out in a few weeks, despite my neighbors being upset that I'm leaving. To address another thing, I didn't see any of the swastika tattoos until months after I had been hanging out with them. He had his shirt off for the first time, and there were 3 on his body. Confused me because Amber and Ed were super Wiccan, so I believe that his tattoos were for protection in prison. Either way, after that, I stopped hanging out with them, and would only speak to them if we were both outside at the same time. When I was in 6th grade, I was in band. Clarinet. I wanted to play saxophone, but my grandpa had a clarinet, so that's what it ended up being. The band instructor was a middle-aged woman who I'm going to refer to as Miss Fond, so as to protect her identity. Anyways, I didn't have a lot of friends, so I had a lot of extra lessons after school. After a while, she started offering me extra lessons at her house. Even then, that made me uncomfortable, and I refused. She was pretty persistent though, and would offer at least once a week. Eventually, I just stopped going back for extra lessons. One day, Miss Front announced that we had been invited to a Christmas parade downtown. Awesome, that's great. The school is literally a year old. It's great exposure, and best of all, fun for the kids. We were excited. We all had extra rehearsals, and the school made sure we had whatever we needed. Permission slips were signed. Everything went perfectly. The day of the parade, we all met at our designated areas. As we get dropped off, Miss Front tells me that parents were to pick us up at the end, and her and some parade officials were the ones watching over us after they left. The parade starts. Everything goes smoothly, at least from my perspective. I was so nervous that there could have been a 5-float pile up, and I probably wouldn't have noticed it. At the end, everyone gets picked up, and I'm last. Left alone with Miss Frond, she immediately grabs my hand, after the last kid's out of sight, and tells me that I can call my mom from her house. She starts booking it, with me in tow. I had very little experience of being on my own, and didn't know how to act in this kind of situation, so despite the fact that I had recently been uncomfortable around her, I went along. Looking back, it probably didn't look that unusual to anyone, because she wasn't tall, and I really shot up in 6th grade, so it's not like I was being dragged. I kept up pretty well. I couldn't tell you in particular where she took me, but it was definitely further out than where everyone else parked. Her car is the only one in sight, and she starts beelining towards it. It was one of those dark blue-green SUVs that pretty much everyone had in the late 90s. Suddenly, I hear my name being yelled from behind me. I turn to see my mom, panting and sprinting towards us. Miss Franz's grip tightens and she starts speeding up. My mom yanks me from her grip and without a word takes me to her car, and we went home where she proceeds to frown over me, which was confusing because I was pretty much ignored 99% of the time. I had no idea what just happened. I never saw Miss Franz again in school or heard anything about her ever again. I don't even know her first name to look her up, and my family never spoke about it again. When I was in my early 20s and living in Chicago, I wasn't making much money. When I found this apartment, it was too good to be true. The top floor of the duplex with 6 rooms for $775 a month. The agent who showed me the apartment stressed to me that the landlords were very religious. I didn't have a problem with that, even if it did sound a little ominous. The landlords were an elderly couple that lived downstairs. They seemed okay at first. When I saw them in the yard, they would smile at me. I took good care of the house. Then when they saw me having my boyfriend over, things started to get really weird. One day when I was in my office writing, I hear a knock at the door. I open it, and it's the old lady from downstairs. Before I could say hello, she says, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" I shut the door in her face. No thanks. This was a mistake. The house was laid out kind of weird. There was a door at the bottom of the flight of stairs that I thought led to a communal laundry room, but after accidentally opening it once, I discovered it led directly into my landlord's living room. I unfortunately learned this the hard way. I was in my kitchen cooking. My boyfriend was at work, and I was by myself when I heard what sounded like a click of the door. "Okay," I said out loud. "What the fuck was that?" I didn't really make the connection. It could have been the door that led into their living room. I walk into the hallway and look around. I don't see anyone at the end of the hallway. I poke my head into all the rooms. Nobody's there. Then I look down the staircase leading to their house, and the neighbor lady is standing there, staring down at me. I screamed. She flinched and stepped back into her apartment and swung the door shut. After that, every time I left my house, and I spent every possible moment out of the house after that, I would come back and something would be moved. A window would be shut. Once, the shower was dripping and my towel was damp. I couldn't lock the door because since it was technically a door to their house, they were the only ones that had the key. The knocking was so frequent, 3 or 4 times a day, that me and my boyfriend propped up an old mattress so we wouldn't have to hear it while we slept. The second to last straw was when I opened the door for work and the stairs were gone. I physically could not leave my house because there were no stairs. They had been dismantled and were sitting on their porch. I called them repeatedly, but they didn't answer. Finally, their son came out of the house and explained that they were remodeling their stairs. He told me that I had to cut through their apartment downstairs. I descended the stairs and opened the door, and they were both sitting at their filthy table, staring at me. The phone was in its cradle. They must have heard it ringing. They kept staring at me with this blank look on their faces. I crossed their kitchen and left out their back door. A few days later, I came home from my job and noticed that the bathroom floor was almost completely flooded. It was like someone had left the faucet on or the shower on. The old woman, seeing that I had come home, came upstairs and knocked, screaming at me that I had flooded the bathroom and that her son had to come and fix it. I was so run down at this point that I just told her okay. Her son comes by a few hours later. He is shit-faced. I open the door and tell him that I need an hour or so before he comes in, and he picks up something and swings it at me. It was a massive wrench. I somehow duck out of the way, and he stumbles over. I book it down the newly repaired stairs and as quickly as possible call the police. They come down and take my complaint and claim since there is no physical contact, they can't really do anything. I learned later that this old couple has a daughter on the force. In the middle of the night, me, my boyfriend, and several of his friends pack all of our stuff into a Chevy Astro van. We lived in hotels and the van for a month until we found another house. They never attempted to contact us. Old landlords, let's not meet again. To set the scene, my friends, a married couple, had just bought a house in Central Oregon. The house was a little ways out of town, set back in the woods bordering a national forest. It sits on almost an acre of fairly wooded land, and there's a small second dwelling in the back that is essentially a one-bedroom house. They were letting me rent it from them, as we had all lived together for the last year in a rental house downtown. It's early July, and I had already moved in, a few weeks ahead of them because the husband was finishing an accelerated summer class. I was working from home and was the only one there on the property. This was a bit before I adopted my dog, so I was really alone. All the neighbors are a ways away, since all the plots were several acres minimum, so the little house was fairly isolated. It was about 9:30 a.m. and my work is in full swing. I would start early in the morning, and the phones were generally extremely busy at the time. Suddenly, I hear a knock on my door. This freaks me out because I was supposed to be alone on the property, but I quickly push my anxiety out of my mind and figure one of my friends probably came to work on the house and needed something from me. With the way the front door is positioned in relation to my windows, I have no way of seeing who's at the door without opening it. I open it to see a little old lady standing there. She introduces herself as the previous owner of the house and asks if I'm the new homeowner. I tell her no, that I'm renting the small unit from the homeowners, but that they would be moving in a few weeks from now. She then asked me if she could take some flowers from the garden, claiming that she planted them for her dead mother. I tell her to go for it because I don't really care and need to get back to work. So I close the door and go back to work. Later that day, when I clock out for lunch, I call my friends and tell them what happened. They seem oddly unsettled by the whole thing. They explained to me that the house had been owned by one couple since it was built, and their daughter, who was not the woman at my door, as she was selling it because they had both passed away. This left me feeling a bit odd, but I shrugged it off and tried not to overthink about it. About a week later, my friends are doing work in the main house, but had parked in the garage so it didn't look like anyone was there. I was working again, as usual, when I hear what sounded like someone walking through the brush outside. I texted my friend to ask what he was doing outside my house, but he said that he wasn't at my house and that they were both still in the main house. So I got up and looked through the blinds into the backyard, and there's the woman rummaging through the brush. I couldn't tell what she was doing exactly, as the brush was fairly high back there, but when I went out later, it seemed like she had been digging. Of course, this freaked me out a bit. My car was the only one visible, so it would seem like I was alone. I immediately called my friends in the main house, who came out with a dog to figure out what she was doing. The dog started barking as soon as they walked into the yard, because it barks at everything. But he was still out in the front of the house. She was behind it. As soon as she heard the dog, I heard her start moving hurriedly away from the house. At this point, she moved to one of the blind spots on the side of the house by the garage, so I could no longer watch her through my window. I heard my friend call after her, but she took off into the woods. There had been no other cars at the property, so she hadn't driven up. We never managed to catch her, as she had a pretty good head start, so I don't know what she was doing around my house. I adopted a dog a few days later. I had been in the process since before the initial encounter. It's pretty frightened by anything unexpected, so she barks and growls any time a pine cone falls and hits the roof. Sometimes she will bark at what seems like nothing, especially in the beginning. I don't know if it was my friend or my dog who ultimately scared her off, but I haven't seen her since. To the flower lady, let's not meet again. This happened several years ago when I lived with my ex-boyfriend. We recently moved into a 2-bedroom house and set to work turning it into a home. We turned the back bedroom into an office, as the house only had one bathroom and it could only be reached through that bedroom. We would have people crash on our sofa regularly and didn't fancy them having to trapeze through our bedroom to get to the loo in the middle of the night. So we had been living there roughly a month when this event occurred. My ex was out with his colleagues and I was home alone. I had spent the early evening watching TV and eating takeout. A couple times I heard some strange noises, but whenever I would try to zone in on it and figure out what the hell it was, it would stop. It had got later, so I decided to go upstairs and use the computer for a little bit before going to bed. At this point in time, we hadn't had our phone lines installed, and I was still on a pay-and-go phone, which had run out of credit. I basically had no way to communicate with anyone while I was in the house that night. So I'm sitting in the back room with only a small table lamp that barely forms a glow. While I'm typing away on the laptop, I heard the noises again. It started as a light rattling noise, really faint, to the point where I had to strain to see if I was really hearing it or if I was imagining it. I shut the music off and tried to figure out what it was. I went into our bedroom and looked down to our front door. Nobody's there. I go back into the back bedroom but can't see much out that window. We had a small yard with a high brick wall and I saw a wooden gate with nothing to cast any light. From what little I could see, there was nothing in the back either. I sat back down and switched the music back on. Maybe 10 minutes later I hear an eerie screeching sound, like metal on metal. Again, very faint, as if whatever was making it was trying desperately to be quiet. I was getting more than a little freaked out at this point, so I went out of our bedroom to retrieve a heavy iron rod that we had found in the back of the built-in wardrobe. I didn't switch on any lights as I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't want to alert any possible intruders of my location in the house. Remember, I had no way of calling anyone, and I was getting more than a little concerned that someone might actually be in my house. I made my way back into the office bedroom and closed the door as quietly as possible before bolting and lodging a chair under the handle. Nothing more happens for a good 20 minutes or so. I start feeling a little foolish for letting myself get worked up and put it down as being my first night alone in the house. But I don't switch the music back on this time, which was lucky because I started to hear sounds like two people whispering, both male voices. They didn't sound like they were coming from inside the house though. I had the office window open ever so slightly, and the sound seemed to be floating in from there. I headed into the bathroom to see if I could get a better look into the alley that the house backs into. The office bedroom and the bathroom formed a L around a yard, with the bathroom extending further out. I climbed up on the ledge and inched the window open trying to see out into the alley. I couldn't see anything, but the whispering was louder and coming directly behind the gate. I couldn't hear the whole sentences, but I heard enough to summarize. Whoever these men were, they'd seen us move in, and seen that we had quite a lot of valuable equipment. Guitars, computer, my DSLR, TV, gaming consoles, etc. I imagined they'd seen that I was home alone, and had been waiting for me to go to sleep before trying to get into the house. I stayed perched there for what felt like an eternity, until what seemed like the loudest thud in the world echoed up to me. They had grown tired of trying to be stealthy, and one or both of them were throwing themselves into the gate, trying to break it down. I could see it shuddering under the blows. I could only imagine how large these men must be. I'm a teeny girl, all about 5'3", and at that point weighed somewhere around 105 pounds. I was white with terror as I watched the gate groan under the stress. I sat clutching the iron rod, trying to think where I could hide from them. Suddenly, a glaring light behind me. At first I panicked and dropped out of sight, thinking they were shining a torch at the back of the house. But then I heard barking and shouting. I peeked again and saw that the house, which was across the alley from us, had a floodlight installed, and it was illuminating both their own yard, mine, and the alley with light. I heard grumbling and cursing and 2 sets of footsteps hurrying down the alley. I stayed locked in the bathroom until my ex-boyfriend drunkenly rolled in at 4 a.m. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and when I went out into the yard that morning, my gate was hanging on by one hinge, allowing easy access from the alley. When I looked at the back of it, the keyhole was covered in scratches, as if someone tried to force open the lock. If they hadn't woken the house behind us, I dread to think what could have happened. I don't tell this story often because, even in 2019, when it's less and less acceptable to victim blame, I still don't like having to answer the questions like, what time was it? And what were you wearing? I went to a college in a sleepy town near the US-Mexico border. With 100,000 people, it's small enough to know many, but big enough that new faces don't stand out. I frequented this walking trail that ran alongside the main road in town. The street was well driven and the path was used by runners, walkers, bikers, and people with strollers. Unless you were there near 11 p.m. at night, like I was the last time I ever walked it. I was a half mile from home. I had my headphones in and was walking to clear my head from some stubborn anxiety. Ironically, fear that something bad was going to happen. A car, I can't tell you what kind, slows as it sees me. At the time I thought it was a black Mustang, specifically the one a friend of mine drove. I approached the car thinking it was my friend. Smallish towns, you know? As I get closer, I see it's not my friend. It's a man that I had never seen before. Shaved head, glasses, yellow graphic tee of sorts. I distinctly remember thinking that he looked like my Uncle Dan. I stopped where I was, even took a step back. His lips were moving, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Being the painfully polite person I am, I take a step closer to hear him better. I make out the word campus. Was he asking for directions to the campus? He nodded. I replied to him, which campus? The community college or university? He stumbled, clearly not prepared enough to know that he would have to answer a question. He stammered out the name of the university in a way that it made my head scream. He's not from here. Nevertheless, I told him it wasn't far. He would just need to turn around and go about 3 or 4 miles. Another quiet utterance that I couldn't make out. One more cautious step forward. What? My heart is pounding. I know this guy is a creep, but I don't know what kind of creep he is. I've been staring at his face the whole time, but it wasn't until the last step forward that I noticed the way his hand was sitting and what he was holding. He flashed a handgun. As soon as he saw me see it, he said in a perfectly audible voice, "Get in the car." I completely froze. I didn't run. I didn't scream. Most assuredly, I did not comply. I just stopped functioning for a few seconds. Again, "Get in the damn car." He was getting nervous. His hand was twitched on the gun. To this day, I can't explain why my brain chose to have me turn and walk away from the car. Walk. I heard the car start, and somehow I knew this was the end for me. He was turning around for me. I didn't want to watch. No one would even come for me if I screamed. I just walked, resigned in the moment. I had given up. I can't tell you why. Instead of turning around though, he slammed on the gas and fled, leaving me a shaking, profoundly vulnerable mess. Enough wit returned to me after a minute or so for me to call 911. A couple cop cars showed up shortly after and took my statement. I remember thinking that the cops didn't believe me. One said I was pretty calm for someone that almost got abducted. I was even making jokes. For months after that, I scoured the internet looking for news stories about missing women or attempted abductions, hoping that I'd find a mugshot with his face on it. I never found one.
Hiking alone always used to be a great way for me to clear my head, have some time alone, and get a workout in as well. After what happened this morning, I doubt I'll ever hike alone again. It was around 6 a.m., and I was surprised that it was as light as it was, so I decided to go earlier than I had originally planned. I have hiked this trail many times because it's so close to the area that I live in, Colorado Rocky Mountains, for anyone looking to identify region-specific creatures. I've hiked it both alone and with a group of people. I have never had an experience in this canyon, though I have heard that it is haunted, as many Native Americans are rumored to be buried all along the canyon, which is peppered with many hiking trails and a beautiful drive. I set off on my hike, and nothing was out of the ordinary. There were only 2 people I encountered, a woman who was running down the trail and a man who was birdwatching. I got past the main flat part of the trail where there was a big clearing, and I could see about 100 feet in every direction and into the more heavily wooded area with a steep hill to my left and a creek to my right. Around this time is when I started hearing someone shouting. It sounded very far off, and I couldn't distinguish any words. I figured maybe someone was calling for their dog or for someone else in their party. It came and went intermittently, as if it was on the wind. But I did notice that the voice was saying the same thing over and over again, in a strange intonation that sounded almost sing-song. I was not afraid at this time, with it being light out and having seen other people on the trail. I stopped to take a couple of pictures right off the main trail. The light was gorgeous and hitting the water and greenery beautifully, and then I began walking again. Maybe 5 minutes later is when I heard it. The same voice I had heard earlier, except this time it sounded as if it was directly above me on the slope. I instantly felt a chill and began looking around for the source of the noise, but I couldn't see anyone. It was close enough that even through the summer foliage, I should have been able to see the person, if it was a person. I still couldn't make out what the voice was saying, but it was a 2-syllable word. At this point, I wondered if it was some psycho looking for a young female hiker to murder, as that's often something I worry about when I hike alone. I bolted back down the way I came, practically running down the trail. I heard a crash behind me, as if something heavy landed on tree branches and cracked them. I've spent most of my life in and around forest animals. I know what deer and smaller creatures sound like, and this sounded much bigger and much clumsier, like what people sound like when they go through the undergrowth. Again, I was still thinking that I was going to have an untimely demise on my morning hike from some serial killer. So I picked up my pace, hoping to outrun whoever now seemed to be chasing me. Luckily, I didn't see anyone chasing after me, and the voice seemed to stay in the same location. It may have just been the panic of the situation, but I could have sworn that the voice changed its unintelligible word to my name as I ran away from it, which is just 1 syllable, and just drew it out long with the same intonation. It was odd, as if it was just going, Kay, Kay. It was at this moment that I realized that I might not be dealing with a psycho at all, but something paranormal, because nobody out there should have known my name. After I reached the main flat area of the trail, the voice disappeared completely. I made it to my car in about 15 minutes. I hadn't gotten very far on my hike, and I drove up the road. The road runs parallel to the trail for almost a mile across the creek, so I was hoping to see if I could see anyone from a slightly higher perspective. I didn't, and I drove to a different location to finish my hike somewhere a lot more populated, which in hindsight also wasn't a smart move because that trail is also rumored to be haunted. Nothing else strange happened, though I was still shaken up and trying to convince myself that it was just someone calling for their dog. Now, I have some theories, because as I said, the entire canyon is rumored to be haunted. It may have been a ghost of some sort, but because of the Native Americans that inhabited the area for a long time, I wondered if maybe it was a Wendigo. From my scant knowledge, I know that they can imitate human voices, and sometimes they can know your name. I'm a little freaked out, especially because this haunted canyon is only a few miles from my house. If anybody knows what I encountered, would you let me know? I live in Florida and have always been aware of many Native American cultures, even though I'm not of that heritage myself. I'm not sure if this is pertinent or not, but I thought I would throw it out there. I timelined and I tried to write down everything I can remember about my experiences to give me a guide when writing this. It started from when I was very young, and the first instance of this happening was when I was living with my grandmother. She and I were very close, which will play in later. I was wide awake in bed, unable to sleep, with her to my right. There's no doubt in my mind that she was deeply asleep only inches from me. Every television in the house was off, and the only other person in the house was my grandfather, who was asleep in his room. Then, very clearly and loudly, I heard my grandma call me from the kitchen, almost how you'd be called for dinner. I know it's common to hear your name being called mistakenly, but I did more research on this as a teenager, and apparently, when you hear your name being called this loud, you're supposed to reject it. I did not. Not knowing this, I just huddled closer to my grandmother and kept my eyes locked on the open door. The second instance was around 13 or 14, when my father took me on a family trip to Las Vegas. We visited some parts of the Grand Canyon, and while my family was waiting in line for a skywalk bridge we had paid for a tour of, I wandered around the edge, a good distance away from my family. I decided to yell my name into the canyon to hear my echo. When it came back to me, it sounded distorted and almost like my grandmother had yelled my name back. It might not have been my grandmother exactly, but it sounded very similar. Nonetheless, just the fact that it was distorted was enough to scare me a little. I don't put much weight into this experience because it might have just been my voice being thrown back at me in a weird way, but it was still odd. This next one happened when I was 13 or 14 as well. It's the most terrifying one I have had, and every time I tell this story to people, I start to tear up a little. This is the closest I've ever been to whatever this thing is, and proves my point that it's mimicking people I care about. I was on a vacation with my family in Key West. We had rented a home. I invited my best friend, who we'll call Ash, to stay with us. On the third day, we had decided to skip out on the boating trip and mooch off the homeowner's Netflix all day. On about the 5th episode of whatever we were watching, we decided on a snack refill and bathroom break. We pause the television and I make my way to the kitchen. I believed that Ash had followed me into the kitchen and leaned on the island while I prepared some chips with my back turned to her. I held a full conversation with her. I even looked back at her and she was on her phone. I fully had no doubt in my mind that I was talking to and looking at Ash. I turned my back for a split second just to pick up the bowls and suggest that we head back to the couch, when I see the real Ash walk out of the bathroom, which was a solid 30 feet away. My body immediately went cold, and the first thing I asked her was how she got into the bathroom and in and out without me hearing. She then gave me the weirdest look and told me that she'd been in there the whole time, ever since we got up. This is where I start freaking out and insisting that I had just been talking with her and even physically saw her. She joked about doppelgangers and about how maybe she was going to die. I quickly suggested we get out of the house and walk around the neighborhood. We walked around until my mom called me to say that she was back in the house. We are still best friends to this day and have been for 11 years. I asked her about it today before I wrote this. She said that she never heard me talking to anybody at all. Now, at this point, you guys must think I'm crazy, but for this next one, I have a witness. Again, I was on vacation near the Great Smoky Mountains, but just a little west in Sevierville, Tennessee. We had our previous reservations canceled, so we took this little rundown cabin owned by a local woman. Now we got there late at night, and the moment we all stepped out of the car, the first thing we heard was a man's voice saying, "Hey neighbors," coming from a cabin to the left of ours that was higher up on the mountain than we were. We couldn't see the cabin really, just a road that led further up, so we assumed that he could see us, but we couldn't see him. Probably some guy on a balcony. My friendly stepdad yelled a, "Hey," and we waved up toward the direction it came from. It wouldn't have been weird if this didn't happen every time we stepped out of the cabin or car. My family completely wrote it off as some type of hospitality we weren't used to in Miami. Retelling it, my brother and my friends agreed it was weird. I did hear constant footsteps around the cabin at night, and some outside my window. It was a raised cabin, probably a story or two off the ground. But I didn't give it much thought, since wildlife is a thing in the woods. I just thought I should mention it maybe. The thing that really propelled me into researching what the hell was happening to me was when I was having a photo shoot in the woods behind the cabin. Both my brother, sister, and I heard something calling my name deeper into the woods. Since I was with my younger siblings, I went into full big sister protection mode and almost threw them back down the little slope that we had to climb to get up into the woods. We were all shitting bricks from how clear it was, and how we all pinpointed that it was coming from deeper in the woods and nowhere near the cabin. This was during the day, and we were all so thrown by this that we stayed in for the rest of our trip. We all agreed it was a woman's voice. And the first thing I asked my mom when we got inside was, "Did you call me?" She had been lounging in her room with my stepdad all day, trusting that I could take care of the younger ones just outside the cabin. She saw how freaked out the kids were, and we really didn't go out at night for the rest of our trip. I think I reacted badly to this one, mostly because I had kids to take care of, and I could tell that they were terrified out there. Again, the voice sounded like someone was looking for me, or calling me back somewhere. With no knowledge of what this could be, I had finally decided to look into things and figure out why something keeps calling me into the woods. I started my search when I turned 17. I had no previous knowledge of wendigos or skinwalkers or anything cryptid-like, only shitty ghost investigations and Zach Baggins making something out of a scratchy EVP. I'm desperate for answers because at this point I'm constantly thinking about it and driving myself into rabbit holes of information and myths and legends. Please let me know what you think it could be. I want to know who's calling me into the woods, or what, and more importantly, why. I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail, because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, This particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and a car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45 p.m., which for those of you who don't backpack is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. So I figured if I moved quickly enough, I could at least get 2 or 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and set up camp, with only my headlamp as a light source. I was trying to move fast, and I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. I figured that meant it was at least habitable. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood and got it going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I'd brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike in had almost gone away, but it was still there a little bit, side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I would have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site that I had chosen was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle and past it are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire, eating my dinner, when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and toward the area where I had seen the rock come from. But due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in complete disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for what or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray far from my fire that, in hindsight, offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear, and I assumed that whatever it was, they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I fell asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got, as I came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp to look around. Off in the woods, I was able to see a light, about 15 feet away. My light. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground on a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I almost shit my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options. stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out here with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light. So I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night. Eventually, it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but it was there. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk too far away, and I would lose the sound of its steps. But then, an hour later, maybe 2, it would return, still as faint as ever. This went on for about 3 to 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer, until they were about 7 feet away from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small as I had run out of wood on my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there still for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand and praying that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked the Subaru, jumped in, and drove. I didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see and talk to another human being. As I exited the store, I was able to read something that was written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person, or something, living in the Superstition Mountains. There's a reason that rumors surround that place. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. I was about 7 or 8, and my parents were out of the house for group stuff. We're pagan. My aunt, who lived in Ohio, was with us at the time. She had to watch us. I remember walking into the living room and seeing my aunt and brother watching Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I smiled, grabbed my iPad and my earbuds, and walked back to the bedroom. After a couple of minutes, I thought I heard walking from the hallway. I looked over and saw a woman that I didn't know, walking with her head down in all white clothes down the hallway. I screamed, but nobody heard me until I ran out of the room crying. It felt like I was dreaming or having a nightmare while I was in the living room because nobody could hear me until I literally sat by my aunt. Then she told me something. I was crying and I said, "I saw something walk past my bedroom." She said, "Oh no, but I have a question for you. Did one of your relatives ever die?" Then I remembered we were living in my great-grandparents' house and they died 3 years ago. And while the lady was walking down the hallway, she was going toward my parents' room. That's where my great-grandmother used to sleep before she died. When I was 11, my dad, my sister, and I moved into a townhouse. At night, I would wake up and see 2 different men, they were different every night, walk into my room. My room was right next to the bathroom, which is where the 2 men would walk in from. One would have a top hat and a tailcoat. The other wore dark sunglasses and a trench coat, but the silhouettes would change. It would creep me out so much that I would hide under my covers. Sometimes I got too scared and slept in my dad's bed. One night, I was sleeping in my dad's room, and 2 identical twin girls with long black hair and hollowed-out eyes came up to my dad while he slept. They didn't say anything. They just stared at him, and then they went away. Our neighbor John told me that I could see ghosts. I've been told I'm a medium, but I block it out as an adult. I'm 20 now. In John's house, I saw a woman hanging by the neck in his kitchen, and then in the basement, a man with a cleaver dripping in blood. I was so scared that I left. Now I'm 20 and I still believe in ghosts. People tell me that I should develop my gift, but I don't know if I want to develop it any more than it already has. My parents explore abandoned towns and mines as a hobby. When I was younger, I would get dragged along with them, but when I started college, I stopped going along. However, in those times that I did go with them, I encountered a lot of things that made me very uneasy. Of course, I am and always have been a bit of a skeptic, so I always just assumed that it was the atmosphere getting to me. But there was one time that I legitimately cannot explain what I saw. For context, I live in Arizona, and most of the places we explored were in the northern part of the country. There's quite a few towns that are dying or have already died, and there are plenty of mines that have long since been out of operation. I can't remember where this encounter took place, but I do know my parents wanted to visit after they saw some paranormal investigation show had covered the site of this abandoned mine. My parents aren't exactly paranormal investigators, but they do like visiting and photographing creepy locations. And supposedly haunted locations usually end up having some truly haunting imagery. Getting to this mine was more trouble than any of us expected. The road was so rough that we had to park off on the side of the road and walk a mile or two to even get to the mine. I don't remember if she heard this from someone in the local town or if it was mentioned on the TV show, but apparently, a few years prior, a couple of kids went exploring at the mine and went missing. It was an assumption that the kids probably fell down an open shaft, as they weren't blocked off, and once I got a good look at them myself, they truly did look like bottomless pits. More so than any other creepy place we had visited before, I just felt so uncomfortable in this place. I'm not a particularly violent person, but a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me to push my stepmom down into the mine shaft. After all, she was standing right in front of them with her back turned to me while she was trying to take a picture down it. It would be so easy. No matter how much I tried to shake off the idea, I couldn't help but feel like it was in my best interest to just push her down that mine shaft. Once she stepped away from the bottomless pit, the thoughts went away and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I've heard that these kinds of morbid thoughts aren't too uncommon, especially around ledges, but part of me just feels like this was different, even though I can't say I have any proof that it was. It's just that I felt this feeling of overwhelming hatred come over me in those moments that she was standing in front of the shaft, and a few seconds that they were there felt like hours to pass. After she was done taking pictures around the area, she went to go photograph some other areas while my father and I started walking down a path to go see if there was anything of interest on the other side. While we were coming around a bend in the path, we saw someone else. It was a man who looked to be in his mid-20s. He was decked out in full mining gear, and although I am no expert on mining attire, it definitely looked old-fashioned. He gave us a wave, and walked off the path toward an empty clearing, where I assumed there were probably more open mine shafts, although I wouldn't know, because it was at that point that my father immediately turned to me and told me that we had to get my stepmother and leave right away. I've tried coming up with explanations for who this man was, but there are a lot of things that just didn't add up. The mine there was not operational, so obviously there shouldn't have been anyone in full mining gear walking around. I considered for a long time that he could have just been someone who wanted to play a practical joke on anyone who went there after seeing the paranormal TV show. However, we saw no vehicles on the way up the rugged road, and we didn't visit this place right after the TV show aired. It was at least 6 months after the show had aired, if not longer. Not to mention, this place wasn't easy to find. We literally had to hunt down locals and ask them for directions because even Google Maps wasn't that helpful in telling us where to go, given that the road leading to the mine was unmarked. It's been 7 years, and I still get the chills whenever I think about it. First off, I'm telling this story from what my brother told me. A few years back, my brother saw something that he has never seen again, but we have gone back multiple times to try to find it. He was with his girlfriend at the time and one of his old friends, riding up in the outskirts of a small town nearby. The hills he would go riding around used to be a very popular place for mining about 60 or so years ago. It was late at night, and his friend was riding on a four-wheeler behind the truck my brother and his girlfriend were in. This is desert area, by the way, not a populated area at all, only for people who want to go camping or mudding. As they were driving along, his girlfriend says, "Hey, what's that?" So my brother looks off to the side where she's looking, and quite a ways away, there's this random light, just there, off in the distance. But it wasn't like a flashlight or a headlight. It was just a floating light, almost like a lantern or something. So my brother slows down, trying to get a better look at it, and suddenly, the light starts moving right toward them. It was fast enough to where it couldn't have been someone on foot, but it definitely wasn't a vehicle or anything, due to the location from which it was coming. My brother suddenly gets really scared and hits the gas as the light gets close enough to get right up near the side of the truck. His girlfriend is screaming because she doesn't know what's going on, and his friend behind them on the four-wheeler is trying to keep up. The light follows them, but my brother and his friend manage to go fast enough to get off the dirt road and onto the paved road a ways down. My brother doesn't stop driving for about 1.5 miles before he feels far enough away to stop and quickly load the four-wheeler into the truck before continuing. Just as he finished loading it into the back of the truck, the light was back and heading right for them from down the road. My brother freaked out, jumps in the truck with his friend, hitting almost 100 miles per hour all the way home, not even caring if he got pulled over. The weird thing was, the friend behind them on the four-wheeler never saw the light or knew what they were talking about. Only him and his girlfriend saw it. The theory is that they had seen the light of a ghost miner, since mining, like I said, happened in that area a lot back in the 60s. They actually went back a couple of hours later that same night, just so he could prove to his friend that he wasn't lying.
Myself and my partner rented our first house back in 2012. Nothing creepy or particularly off-putting about it. Just a standard terrace house on a street of identical houses, in a northern town in England. My partner, now wife, was pregnant at the time, so we needed somewhere to bring up our first child. We chose this one as it was an area we were familiar with, and the rent was affordable. When we moved in, everything was normal, just a standard house, and we set about getting furnished and all the usual stuff. I used to take my wife to work early in the morning, and I'd drop her off and come back home. The front door opened directly into the living room, and there was a sliding door from this room which went into the kitchen. This had a door going out the back to an enclosed yard, shared with a nearby house, and stairs leading upstairs. There was also a frosted glass window next to the sliding door, which was presumably once a serving hatch, but now just served to let some natural light in, as the sun never got to the front of the house, due to the narrow street and surrounding houses. Within a few weeks of moving in, I developed a weird feeling, like something was watching me through the window. It wasn't overpowering, but it did get to the point whereby I'd actively avoid looking at it out of the corner of my eye, as some part of me was always worried I might see something on the other side looking back. I'd always been deeply skeptical about anything paranormal, so always tried to ignore it or laugh it off, as me just being stupid in what was an unfamiliar house. That said, the feeling became stronger, to the point that after dropping my wife at work, I'd come home and catch a few hours on the sofa in the living room, as I didn't want to go into the kitchen and up the stairs to bed. The feeling was definitely the strongest in the kitchen and on the stairs, and the only way I can describe it is it felt predatory, like the constant nagging feeling that something was either watching you or right over your shoulder about to rush you, even though there was nothing there. Things seriously escalated after one particular evening. We were watching a Darren Brown TV show, where he was disproving the idea of the paranormal and seances. Part of the show asked you to perform an Ouija board at home, and the premise was that he would lead the responses and tell you what the results you would get, thereby removing any idea of it being anything more than suggestion and parlor trick. My skeptical nature combined with my wife's belief in the paranormal meant that I was keen to go along with this and prove how her beliefs were silly. We started the Ouija board and went along with all the instructions, except we didn't get the results the show said we would. We got something far more sinister. When we asked the name of any spirit, rather than the scripted name we were supposed to get, we got the name Ernest. By this point, I'm laughing, thinking my wife is pranking me, that Ernest is a stupid name to come up with. My wife isn't laughing though, and says we should stop. Thinking that it's all her, I go along with it. Do you like us living here, Ernest? No. Why not, Ernest? What do you think about me? Rogue. Now it's worth mentioning that this confused me. My only experience of the word rogue was various classes in video games. Okay, what do you think of my wife's name? Whore. Wife is getting more upset by this point. It's really quite distressed. We follow the rules and say goodbye. The glass we were using as a planchette goes to goodbye. The board we were using was made out of scraps of paper with letters and numbers, and the usual yes, no, hello, and goodbye on them. As my wife was so freaked out by this, I collected them together, put them in a glass bowl, and took them out to the yard and burned them, partially for her peace of mind, and partially for my own. That night we had gone to bed, and around 20 or so minutes after we got in bed, we heard a loud bang that came from downstairs. I went downstairs to check everything, thinking something may have fallen over, but everything was still in place, so I went back to bed. As we lived in a terrace house, I told my wife it might just be the neighbors banging on a cupboard door, and went back to sleep. The next night we went to bed. Within the first half hour of being in bed, the exact same bang from downstairs. This happened every night, no matter what time we went to bed, whether it was 9 p.m. or 1 a.m. Within half an hour, we heard the same bang, always at least once, sometimes twice. We tried to replicate it. After trying everything, we discovered that a heavy cupboard door in the corner of the kitchen, when open and then let go, made the same exact noise. I was pretty intrigued and keen to find out what it was, as we never had any signs of pests or vermin, and the cupboard was fixed to the wall, about 6 feet off the ground, so I asked my wife to let me set up a camera in the kitchen, recording after we went to bed. She wouldn't let me though, as she said she didn't either want to know or didn't want to antagonize it if it was anything. Things really began to go downhill from here. We would find ourselves arguing over the smallest things, having full-blown shouting arguments for hours over nothing, despite normally being a very chilled person, often accused of being too laid back. I found myself constantly on edge, in a combination of what I can only describe as anger and anxiety. Things didn't happen overnight, and was something that built up slowly within both of us, to the point I didn't notice it was happening until much later. There was no waking up a different person moment, but a slow and subtle change. Despite never having before, I began suffering nightmares on a regular basis. I would have vivid dreams of family members dying in horrific ways, such as being burned alive. I would wake up screaming or in tears, as my wife would have to spend an hour reassuring me that they weren't real and calming me down. The most disturbing thing was, she said she'd waken up and tossed and turned due to being heavily pregnant, and I'd lay there with my eyes wide open, staring blankly like I was asleep, but with my eyes open. And when she told me to close them, I would, with no other reaction or comment. I absolutely have no recollection of ever doing this, and have never done this at any point before, or since living in that place. The arguments continued and got worse. The regular bang at night continued, and for the overall sense that something was following me, particularly in the kitchen and stairwell, became more and more overpowering. That, despite my best efforts to convince myself I was just being ridiculous and trying to force myself to walk slowly. It was clearly that flight of stairs 3 steps at a time filled my adrenaline and my heart pounding in my ears. There was a brief lull in activity in the months or so before our child was born. It was around Christmas and the arguments had abated, and we seemed to get back to ourselves. I thought we had turned a corner. The nightly bangs persisted, but we'd become so used to it we would now just look at each other and roll our eyes. My wife told me that the kitchen/living room window and the sense of being watched or followed was something she was experiencing too. Then our little boy was born. Everything was okay for the first week or so, but the atmosphere soon began to change. The sense of anger and anxiety began to creep back in, and we were starting to bicker. The atmosphere was made worse as our newborn baby would just cry constantly, every hour of the day when he was in the house. He'd sleep for 20-minute intervals, and the rest of the time he would spend trying to nurse, win, feed, distract, play. Anything to try and soothe him, but nothing worked. We had him back and forth to hospitals and doctors so many times in the first few months. But inevitably, when we got there, he was calm and sleeping, or giggling happily. The doctors would look at us like we were crazy, and I was beginning to think that I was cracking myself up. But when we got home, the crying would begin again. We would take it in turns and see him at night. But that wasn't helped by the fact I was now apparently doing the weird sleeping with the eyes open thing again. It culminated for me one night when I was laid in bed, waiting for the inevitable cry to start, when I saw a shadow from the corner of my nearest window and began to slowly move across the fitted wardrobes we had in the room. I initially thought it was being created by the curtains against the headlights of a moving car slowly down the road, but it wasn't moving right. The best comparison I can make is like that of ink being dropped into water. The room was dark to try and help our boy sleep, but this was darker than the rest of the room. like a very rich black that seemed to have shapes like smoky tendrils coming off of it. I laid and watched as it inched along the cupboards, and then watched it go along a corner and continued on the wall. I knew at this point it wasn't a shadow, as the shadow would have jumped from the wardrobe to the wall, not creep around the corner that was facing the opposite direction to the window. I watched it go out the door and onto the stairs. Now, if this was to happen now, I would have noped straight out of the room, but at the time I remember being oddly memorized by it, and only started to feel any kind of fear after it left the room. I resolved to not tell my wife, as we'd already experienced enough weirdness to be on edge, and the idea that I may have just witnessed a manifestation would probably have upset her even more. It was winter at this point, and the house was constantly cold, not helped by how dark it was due to the sunlight not being able to make its way in. No matter what we tried, we couldn't get the place to maintain a constant, comfortable temperature. One room may be red hot, but the one next to it freezing, despite the heating being set to the same throughout the house. The rooms which experienced hot and cold varied from hour to hour. The temperature would spike in a room and only fall again to uncomfortably cold in the space of half an hour. We had a room thermometer for our baby, and we were having to constantly move it from room to room to try and find one that was relatively normal. Unfortunately, I found the one place in the house where the temperature remained the most stable was the stairs and landing, so I'd find myself having to sit there fighting the rising anxiety to run, because it was the run room where our child could neither be overheating or wrapped in blankets against the cold. Around this time, I remember a dream quite clearly, where I was talking with a woman, no idea who she was, and saying how dark and cold the house was. She asked me if I knew what that meant. I said not. I remembered even now when she said that life needs light to grow. The only thing that can thrive in darkness is death. It may have been my overreactive paranoia or subconscious, but I clearly remember waking up with those words still in my head. Now, when I hear a lot of these stories, I often wonder why people didn't just get out. There's usually an excuse about not wanting to surrender their home and fighting for their house. Well, this wasn't our house. We were renting it, and all the combined problems of weirdness got too much. We decided we had to move. We found a house a few miles away and gave our notice to the place. It was the night before we were due to move in the early hours of the morning. We heard a piercing siren. We had a carbon monoxide alarm and it was going off. We opened all the doors and windows and got outside. My wife and our boy went to my parents', where I waited for the gas engineer to arrive. He arrived and immediately condemned the gas fire we had in the living room, which had started leaking carbon monoxide. It's difficult not to think that without the alarm, we all could have been dead, and the fact it happened on the day we were due to leave. I couldn't shake the idea that the two were linked, and something either wanted us not to leave, or to give us a parting gift. I'd like to say we moved and everything was better overnight. It wasn't. The new house started out okay. The nagging feeling of being followed around slowly crept back. Not as intense, but noticeably there. In the house, we all shared a bedroom, and had a lot of stuff still packed in boxes and generally cluttered in a spare room. One of them was a bouncer for our baby. This was a Fisher-Price frog-type bouncer, and had eyes in the front. When rolled, would play a tune. Around 4 a.m. one morning, the frog tune started going off. I immediately looked in the crib next to our bed thinking our baby might have gotten out somehow, and started playing with it, but he was fast asleep. I did everything I could to get it to go off again, without spinning the eyes, knocking, hitting the floor around it. I tried to tell myself it was maybe the batteries, but this was the only time it had ever happened. We didn't have to change the batteries for the next 2 years or so we had it. The feeling of being watched grew. Only now, it was strongest from a conservation on the back of the property. My wife and I had been through enough by this point, that we were now openly discussing the weird feelings with each other. There were a set of double doors between the kitchen and conservation. On this one particular night, my wife asked if I'd close them. I didn't ask why, but did so. About an hour or so later, I decided to go back and have a cigarette. As I opened the doors, the glass-paneled French doors of the conversation were in front of me. It was dark outside, so all I could see in the door was the reflection of the light kitchen behind me. As I walked towards the door, I see in the reflection very clearly a black silhouette of a person run behind me, almost like it had run into the house through the exterior wall and straight through to under the stairs. My first thought was it was someone outside, but as I checked, no one was there. I stood there smoking and thinking and realizing it couldn't have been outside, as the figure had passed behind me and was briefly obscured by my own reflection, so it had to have been in the room behind me. I quickly finished my cigarette and went back inside. I sat there mulling it over before telling my wife the next day, to which she had wanted the door shut as she didn't feel comfortable about that room all day, more so than usual. We had a similar instance a month or so later, which could have ended badly. While driving and pulling onto the motorway, interstate for our American friends, slip road, my wife all of a sudden jumped on the brakes. When I asked what the hell she was doing, she said a dark figure had just run out in front of the car. There was literally no one around as the slip road was in a wooded area, away from any built-up spots or paths. I didn't see this myself as I was in the back of the car with our boy, but my mother-in-law was in the front, and she said she saw it too, and was equally spooked. Gradually since then, the feeling of anxiety and tension subsided. We eventually moved again, mirroring our experience of leaving the last place though. On the day we were moving, we were taking our belongings down the drive to the van, when a roof tile slid off and nearly missed hitting me and my brother-in-law, who was helping us. We moved to a house which, out of any, should have been the most haunted, being built earlier than the others in the 1830s. This house, however, was the most tranquil, and had no such weird atmospheres or happenings. All of this was about 6 or 8 years ago now, and we often walked past the first house, and had seen it come up for rent many times since, so nobody seems to stay there long. The funny thing is, we both said a few times how when we went to see it on the market, we both have a desire to go back. We'd even talk about going for a fake viewing just to walk around the place. We never have, but even the idea that after everything, we still feel the urge to go back is something which the rational part of my brain can't really explain. I'm so tempted to go back through all old census records to see if an Ernest ever lived in that house. But so far, I've resisted the temptation to rake it all over for fear of something setting off again. That, and if finding out that someone did, well, I don't know if I'd like the answer. Thanks for taking the time to go through all this. Has anyone had anything similar? Or can anyone offer an explanation as to what this all might have been? I want to start off by saying I have never experienced anything visual like this before. If there's any possible explanation, however, I'm not sure how there could be. I would like to hear it. My girlfriend and I are in the process of moving into a basement suite. We still technically reside at our old place across town for another 3 days. Her name is the only one on the lease since we've been having some relationship issues due to work, stress, and personal problems. The basement suite we moved into had been completely gutted, and most of the appliances and flooring replaced, except for the bathroom. It's now a city-legal suite, with its own water heater, etc. Since there had been a massive police investigation done a few months prior, we weren't told much about what had happened here, other than drug-related incidents. I went into the bathroom to do some cleaning yesterday evening, and noticed what looked like blood at the bottom of the radiator. It seemed creepy and I didn't want to touch it just yet because gross. Anyways, a few hours pass and my girlfriend goes to bed in the bedroom and I fall asleep on the couch watching TV. I woke up around 4 a.m. to our cat knocking a plant off the windowsill and messing with the blinds. The lights were off, but I have a big blacklight aquarium in the living room, which lit up most of the living room/kitchen area. My girlfriend came out of the room to ask what was going on, and I was all pissed off, half asleep, cleaning dirt off the countertops. She told me to leave it for tomorrow and just come to bed, and then walked away. I stayed up and continued cleaning for maybe 20 minutes, since there was dirt all over this place. This is what freaking terrified me, even thinking about it now. I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters. It was pretty dim, but I could still see. It's now around 4:30 a.m. I turned around towards the garbage can, and my girlfriend is standing in the dark doorway, just staring at me. I couldn't see her face clearly, but it was a 6-foot thin figure, the exact build of my girlfriend. I said, "Sorry if I'm keeping you up. I'm almost done." She just stood there facing me. I figured she was just pissed off since we had been arguing off and on this whole week. I finished what I was doing and walked past her and asked if she was coming to bed. She didn't move. I walked straight into the bedroom and closed the door, and my girlfriend was laying there sleeping. I woke her up by closing the door, and I guess the look on my face scared her enough to make her spring up in bed, wide awake, and ask what happened repeatedly. I started gagging, swearing, and pretty much just lost it for a minute or two. I told her I just saw her in the kitchen, and she said, "Well, yeah, I came out earlier and asked what happened." I told her, "No, I just walked past her in the bedroom." She pretty much just went silent, peeked out the door, and nothing was there. We both went to sleep a while later. I don't get strange feelings here at all, which is the weird part. But holy fuck, I have no idea what that thing was last night. And it scared me so bad I almost threw up when I realized my girlfriend had been sleeping that past half hour, and I have no idea what to make of that. Just a little background, I originally come from Ukraine, and I travel a lot all of my life. I studied and lived in England from 12 to around 21 years of age, and now I'm working in Belgium. My mother knew this fortune teller, who was known to be able to diagnose diseases just by holding your hand, as well as predict your future, at least key events. My mother was worried about my future since I had so many opportunities that she took me to see this guy. I had exams coming up, and it was a good way to both distract myself and learn something new. The guy made a total of 7 predictions. I will first mention the one that happened, and the rest that are yet to be. Just to let you know, this guy lives in a tiny village, and never traveled outside of it, nor does he have access to the internet. Anyways, here we go. Number 1. I would get a 82% in my exams. He guessed the exact percent. I wasn't doing very well in my studies at all, and I only started studying probably in the last few months. He put his hands on my forehead and immediately said that I shouldn't worry, as I will get an 82%, which is what I needed to get into university I wanted. That came true, and I went to university. Number 2. I have problems with my liver. I was a very healthy kid, and I did a lot of sports semi-professionally. In my school at 18 years old, I was in football, rowing, and tennis team. I barely drink and eat properly, and had a very healthy body composition. After he said I was going to have problems with my liver, we went to the doctor, and guess what? I had an enlarged and hardened liver. Doctors had no idea what caused it, and to make it normal, I had to do a special diet for 2 months. After that, it all went back to normal. Number 3. I would travel to Finland for work at 23 years old, but not before then. I had a business trip to Estonia and Finland last December, and guess what? I literally traveled to Finland the day before I turned 24. I had no control over booking the tickets or scheduling this business trip. My management sent me on this mission. I'd never been to Finland, nor any Nordic countries ever. Number 4. At 28, I will have 1,000 employees under my management. It hasn't happened yet. I'm currently trying to work myself up to become a project manager, but still not sure if it's possible for this to happen. Right now I manage around 30 employees, so it's a big jump to 1K. But we will see. Number 5, in my lifetime, I will travel to Russia only twice. That hasn't happened yet. Due to a political climate between Ukraine and Russia, I haven't traveled to Russia ever. Although I do want to visit badly. Number 6, I will marry a blonde woman, and we will have 2 daughters. That hasn't happened yet either. It was always a dream of mine to have daughters, not sons. I can't explain why, just always wanted to. I have mostly females in my family, loads of sisters, aunts, and grandmas. So let's see. Number 7, I will move and live in Finland most of my life. Might happen soon. This is quite unbelievable. He said that when he concentrated on my future, he saw the word Suomi around me a lot. At the time, none of us knew what it was. He also said that I would live and probably die in Finland. When I came home and Googled what Suomi is, it turned out to be a language spoken in Finland. And as for working there, when I had a business trip, I made some connections with other colleagues who invited me for some potential working positions. So I might end up moving there sooner rather than later. So that's that. He predicted a lot of things like prostate cancer in early stage for my dad's friend, which saved his life, as well as healing my grandma's depression by one 15-minute talking session. I don't know if there's anything to this guy, but it's sure not just accidents. I thought a long time before posting my story here, or rather 2 that happened to me and one of my colleagues. It's not something scary, but rather something very uncomfortable. And my friends told me it would fit in here. Let's get started. Both stories happened in the summer of 2018, when I was working as a facilitator in a recreation center for children, small sections up to the 1st grade. We were in a kind of park, about 20 minutes away by bus, where we stayed all day before going back to school at about 5 p.m., so that the parents could pick up their children. This park was reserved for us, and therefore nobody else than us. Our managers and those who take care of the canteen are not supposed to be there, especially since around it there is only fields, a forest, and a building site. That was quite far. Now that the context has been set, I begin the first story that happened to my colleague. We had walkie-talkies for the day, which allowed us to reach our managers, the secretary, or the infirmary in case of a problem. But they were returned when it was time to leave, to be recharged during the night. So it was up to the secretary, my colleague, who was the last one to leave around 7 p.m., to put them on charge and then close the shutters and doors and go home. One morning, I think it was around the 8th day, I had been working for a month with the children. We all find ourselves summoned one by one to the office of our leaders, so I go there without really understanding what was going on. I pass in front of the secretary, who doesn't look serene at all, and that worries me a bit. My senior manager asked me if I returned my walkie the day before, or if I knew if someone had taken one. I say that I did return mine, by pointing it out at the charging station, and I explained that I didn't hear anything else. I still ask why I'm being asked this question. Then my manager tells me, the night before at 7 p.m., as she was about to leave, my colleague was closing the shutters when one of the walkie-talkies lit up, and a male voice came on saying, "Hey, beauty of the Isles, you're beautiful when you close those shutters." I had a vile shiver go down my spine, my colleague being the only foreigner on the team. The person who had spoke to her had been looking at her, and really talking to her, and not a hoax. At that time, she had called her roommate who come to pick her up, and left every other day with someone. We never heard from that guy again. Nevertheless, we patrolled for several days to try and notice someone, for our safety, but especially for the children's safety. The second story takes place in the third, and thus the penultimate week of work. It was around 11 a.m. when I got called on the talkie by my manager. She tells me that something very strange has happened. I asked her what it was, and again, I feel the shiver of just anguish. A man had come to the secretary and asked to see me. To see me? Using my first and last name. My manager had gone to see me because she thought it was strange. Because nobody is supposed to show up at my workplace. Apart from my parents and friends. Nobody knew I was there. This man had then introduced himself as my uncle, and that he had come to pick me up for personal reasons. My manager said that I was not on the site, and that was not true, and that she would let me know that he had come by. According to her, he looked very annoyed and left without giving his name. You could say it was a plausible story, but I only have one uncle, who is my godfather, who doesn't fit the description of the man who came, and to whom I don't talk to at all. Again, I have never heard of this man again, and I've never seen him, but I still have this bad feeling that someone I don't know forged an identity to come and get me. Who knows what would have happened if I had gone. I am grateful to my manager, who knew how to smell the trouble. That was a bit of a long story, maybe not very interesting, but it makes me feel good to talk about it. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.